Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Circle. I'm John Kane, and this is the Let's Talk Native podcast. I do this program 2 or 3 times a week, but I also do a radio show. And what I want to talk about today is something that I mentioned on my radio program, which was about what took place in New York City last week. And what happened was the New York City Department of Education, DOE as it's referred to, decided to cancel Columbus Day. And that's okay. I mean, to me, that was an interesting and a good undertaking. I was pleasantly surprised, but it met an immediate backlash. And of course, it met that backlash from the full range of Italian-American politicians in positions everywhere from the city council members, state assemblymen, the mayor of the city of New York, and the governor of New York. They all weighed in, and they all raised hell, and they got immediate satisfaction. So let me explain. So the Department of Education cancels Columbus Day and renames it. They redefine it as Indigenous Peoples Day. And so immediately, all of the powerful Italian figures throughout the state, from, like I said, from the position in the 5 boroughs all the way to the state capitol, raised hell because they genuinely feel like they had something taken from them. Columbus is theirs. And if you're wondering why, well, I think Andrew Cuomo put it best. Andrew Cuomo said, look, regardless of the atrocities that Christopher Columbus committed against Indigenous people, Columbus has come to symbolize Italian-American heritage. And of course, that's just bullshit. Columbus has nothing to do with Italian-American heritage. In fact, he has very little to do with Italian heritage. Italy wasn't even a country in 1492. It was a peninsula. It was a landmass. It didn't have that defined a culture. And to the extent that the lower part of Italia, the peninsula, may have begun to define or have a defined culture, Columbus was from the north. He was from Genoa, which was more into the mainland of Europe. He spoke Portuguese. And Spanish. He wasn't defined in any way, shape, or form as an Italian. He didn't sail for Italy. He didn't sail for Rome either. Now, look, I realize that Italy wasn't a country, but Rome and the Vatican, it was definitely a thing. And it's always been a thing, and it's had a major influence over all of Europe, not just Italy ultimately becoming a country. But he didn't even sail specifically for the Pope, for the Vatican. He sailed for he sailed for Spain, and because of Spain's relationship with the Catholic Church and with the Pope, there was a lot of interaction, a lot of interplay with the doctrine of Christian discovery and the papal bulls that saluted and celebrated Spain's claim to these new lands and all that other stuff. But again, nothing to do with Italian culture. And of course, the fact is that that Columbus never even stepped foot on any territory that the United States claims as its territory. In fact, it is debatable whether he ever stepped foot on anything more than the islands of the Caribbean. And it is pretty well documented that he died believing that he had reached the easternmost islands of Indonesia, not of India, not the country, not the landmass of India, but of what Europe had called the East Indies. That's why Columbus would call the people who lived there in the Caribbean Indians, because he thought he had reached the Indies. And in fact, rather than correcting his mistake, they would actually call the Caribbean the West Indies. Go figure, right? So he would never, I mean, the fact that he had miscalculated the size of the earth and, and had this harebrained scheme that he could actually make it that far around the planet to reach, to reach, again, Indonesia, not only is a tribute to how bad a sailor he was, how bad a navigator he was, how bad an explorer he was, but also how bad at math he was. But, so again, I don't want to, prosecute Columbus again over all this. But seeing the reaction, the immediate backlash, and the satisfaction that these Italian-American politicians got, it leads me to another conversation. And it's a conversation about not just white supremacy, but white privilege and white fragility. And I know that I've talked about some of this before, but I think it's important that people understand. First off, white supremacy is a lie. It's not just a false narrative. It is a lie. White people are not superior. I know it's been said for hundreds of years, that they are. And there is a large segment of the American population that still believes, well, let me back that down. They don't believe that white people are superior. They believe they should be. And this is where white privilege comes in. Because, look, if white people were really superior, you wouldn't need to have systemic racism. You wouldn't have to rig the game. You wouldn't have to create privilege specifically for white people, because they would already be superior and they'd already be benefiting from that superiority. But they don't. What they benefit from is white privilege, from the idea that white people can maintain the wealth and the power and the influence and all of these things. They can control how history is taught, what is considered history. They can control the media. They can control all this stuff. Now, again, I'm not saying that there aren't people of color involved in some of this. But if you look at the makeup of Congress, if you look at the makeup of the Fortune 500 CEOs, if you look at the media moguls and the like, it's clear that it's white folks. So that is not just because they were superior, it's because the system is rigged towards them. I mean, they don't have to deal with things like whether their names are identified as something less than white people because it sounds too black or too Hispanic. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. Many of the immigrant populations that came from Europe that weren't specifically English or Spanish, depending on where in the New World they came to, but many of the immigrants had to endure a certain level of prejudice and discrimination. Now, the difference is, and this is what Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's new book discusses. It's coming out in August. It's called "Not a Nation of Immigrants." What she talks about is the fact that this population that may have been persecuted somehow was enabled to transform themselves, not from the rejected immigrant, but to become part of the settler colonial class. And Italian Americans, did that, and they actually used this idea, this false heroic notion of Christopher Columbus to help. And of course, you also had the Irish population that was trying to advance their Catholic beliefs in an otherwise Protestant-based country. So you had the Italians and the Spanish, the Latin community and and the Irish that were all advancing Catholicism too. So but they all seem to persevere. And even Jewish people, in spite of the persecution that Jewish people experienced, they too were able to transform themselves from a despised immigrant population to part of the settler colonial population, the settler colonial aristocracy, if you will. But you see, the way that white people benefit is, again, it's by rigging the system. And this is what we talk about with white privilege. You create systems that favor white people. Who gets elected, who can serve, who can even vote, all that stuff, right? So that's how you rig the system. Because actually white people are not superior, like I said. So you give them the added benefits to have more control, more power, more wealth, more opportunities. That's what white privilege is. Now, the problem is, at some point, white privilege gets exposed, and the fear of that privilege disappearing becomes white fragility. So there's a trajectory. It's white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility. See, what we saw last week in New York was white privilege that allowed such a population of Italian Americans that spans so many public offices. Again, the governor of the state of New York, the mayor of one of the largest cities in the country, many people in the state assembly, both parties. This isn't Democrat and Republican. This is both. So that privilege is demonstrated, and then their voice gets responded to so immediately. I mean, look, Native people have been complaining about things like Christopher Columbus and Washington, Redskins. We've been complaining about this stuff for decades. Almost on the same freaking day that it gets announced that the New York City Department of Education is canceling Columbus Day, almost the same day, with literally hours, they say, "Oh, we're going to back off of that." So what do? They say, "Well, we're going to call it Italian American Heritage Day and Indigenous Peoples Day." Well, let me give you an analogy. For one thing, I don't know, who would ever think that turning Columbus Day into Italian American Heritage Day is a good idea, or that even changes anything. If you're going to use the day that is widely known as the day that Columbus lands in the Caribbean as the day to celebrate Italians, then you haven't changed anything. You're actually continuing that same false narrative about Columbus, the connection to Italian people. And then you're going to celebrate, you won't celebrate Columbus because, look, some of that stuff's been exposed. But you're still going to connect that day to, who thought that was a good idea? Because let me give you an example of what that would be like. And I know people always get bent out of shape when you bring up Hitler or Nazis or the Jewish Holocaust, but I'm going to do it again. So imagine taking a day that marks Hitler's rise to power. If there's something definitive that you say, this is the day that Hitler arrives. And as a way to diminish that, you take that day and say, we're not going to acknowledge Hitler. We're going to call it Holocaust Remembrance Day because we're going to remember, what a piece of shit Hitler really was. We're going to remember that. And so we hope he turns over in his grave that the day that should have marked his rise to power is actually going to mark the genocide, the Holocaust, the horrors that name and that person represents. So you do that. Well, that sounds like, that's one good way to turn that around. But then you say, but we're not just going to call it Holocaust Remembrance Day. We're also going to call it German Heritage Day. On the same day that you're celebrating Holocaust remembrance, on the day that should have, really twisted this rise to power of Adolf Hitler, you're gonna celebrate German Heritage Day at the same time. That's the analogy. And look, and if you're uncomfortable with it, sorry. As a Native person, I'm telling you in a way that perhaps you can understand, because clearly people don't understand some of the stuff. And look, we oftentimes, as I get involved in the mascot debate, we oftentimes will hear things like, well, the use of this, of Redskin wasn't intended to be insulting. And since there was no derogatory intent, then it's not offensive. Well, let's be clear. Intent has nothing to do with it. Because if you're doing something that is offensive to somebody else, you don't get to decide whether it's offensive or not. You can't punch somebody in the face and then tell that person how much it hurts. It just doesn't work that way. Let me tell you a story, and I've talked about this a little bit. And one of the films that I have screened in New York and other places is the film the Dakota 38. And I know I've talked about this before, but I want to go through it again because I want to explain this part of it a little bit different. Of course, the Dakota 38 are the 38 who were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862, a week before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would come into effect. A week before. So in January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation that he's already gotten out there, people know it's coming, comes into effect. But literally the day after Christmas, a week and a few days before that, 38 Dakota were hanged by the neck. So what happened is there was a group of men from a variety of native territories that know they have their own struggles. And as a means of almost of therapy, a bunch of these guys, decide they're gonna do a ride. And they're going to do a ride that traces the journey that those Dakota 38 had to go on to be hanged. And so they do this ride, and it's December. I mean, again, they don't just trace the journey, but they're doing it at the same time. And it's the Northwest. I mean, it's the Northwest Plains. I mean, it's Minnesota. It's cold. So they do this ride, and it's a rough ride. I mean, it's in the winter, so it's a treacherous ride, and it's tough on the people, it's tough on the animals, and the whole bit. During the film of this, they key in on one of the young guys, Billy Ray Dumark, and he's only like 19, maybe 20 years old, and you could tell he's had a tough time. He's not only doing this tough ride, but there's some indication that he comes from a bad place, in terms of what his siblings have gone through, where he lives, the poverty, the drugs, all that stuff. I mean, this is a native kid who is a product of some of the worst poverty that the United States created for native people. And as he's going through this ride, he lightens up a little bit. You can see almost a little bit of a sparkle in his eye. But one of the things that he struggled with was, because this ride was so tough, a bunch of the white people, starts out with a guy who owns a tire shop who gives them a tire to help them with their horse trailer or truck or something. But then people along the way help. I mean, they took in not only the riders, but their horses. They fed them. They did a couple of, almost like a feast, you might say. At least a couple of occasions. They had shirts that said thank you in Lakota, I think. They were really trying to help these riders. Now, this film was produced by a non-native, but by a young guy from Long Island, as it would turn out. And he's a part of the film. He's in there. He's one of the organizers. So he's part of the documentary. He's not just, off camera. And at one point, because you can tell some of these people are struggling even with the graciousness of these white people. In fact, Billy Ray Dumark says, I have trouble with, I think he might even call them Caucasians. He didn't know what to call them. and he talked about how he struggles with knowing how to react. And it doesn't really get into an explanation. But one of the film's producers says, I don't know why people can't appreciate what these white people are doing. I mean, they couldn't make it any easier. They took care of their horses. They fed everybody. They even had shirts that said thank you in Lakota. And he couldn't get it. But I got it. Because these riders, they are riding through land that used to be theirs. That isn't anymore. That they were screwed out of their land. And these affluent white people who are being generous, and again, let me be clear, they're not trying to offend these Native people. Quite to the contrary. But the level of privilege that they have because they're white, because they now occupy all of the former native lands there and have carved out these affluent lives out of it, it's freaking offensive. They're not trying to be offensive, but it's offensive. So if you're a native rider who comes from a very impoverished place, like Billy Ray Dumark, and now you're trying to face this idea of generosity from white people, and they can be generous because they're affluent white people. And why are they affluent? Because they're making plenty of money off the land that was once native lands. And then Billy Ray, like I said, he lightens up a little bit towards the end. And then now he's talking about how good the ride has been for him and how he can't wait to do it again. And as the film ends, after they make it to Mankato and they do a bit of a ceremony and that kind of stuff, and the credits roll, in the credits this is in memory of Billy Ray Dumark. Doesn't explain anything. So I after the first time I saw the film, I noticed that. So I did my homework. I looked him up. Billy Ray committed suicide. For all of the therapeutic benefit of the ride, once the ride was over, he had to go back home to a place that wasn't so comfortable. And, and again, during the ride, had to wrestle with this idea that he got to see affluence on his homeland that he's not a part of, and then had to return to poverty. Now, I don't know the exact conditions, that there were the day that Billy Ray took his life, but it just kept ringing in my ears. And look, I'm not trying to pick on the film's producer, but the fact that he says, I don't know why these people can't get it, why they can't appreciate what's being done for them. White privilege does not have to intend to offend anybody, Now, I'm going to take this story a little farther because I'm in the midst of doing a I've been fighting the mascot issue in the town where I went to high school, Cambridge, New York, and I'm participating in what they're calling healing circles. And before we actually started the process of healing, and look, and this isn't about me as far as I'm concerned. The healing is about the people of Cambridge trying to deal with the divisiveness that this debate has caused. And so the whole reason for doing this thing is to help the people of Cambridge, come back together. Look, they should have done this after they retired the mascot, in my opinion. But anyway, they're doing it while the debate is raging on. But on the first day that this consultancy group came in to do these healing circles, they did a kind of a sample run. They wanted people to talk about their safe spaces, and and I've talked about this on another show, so I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but it's relevant to this thing. It's relevant to the white privilege we saw in New York City, the white privilege we saw in the film Dakota 38. But two people who are on the board, when they're talking about their safe spaces, and and this is kind of what this healing stuff is all about. We want you to share your safe spaces and why it makes you feel safe. And two of them talked about the land that their families have. One is a farmer and a big farm, 1,000 milking cows, and in fact the farm actually has a native name to it. that has been appropriated too. And I'm not condemning that, but I mean, but so the one board member was talking about how their farm and talking about their farm, has created a safe space for her. And one of the other board members talked about his safe space being the land that his family owned in the lower Adirondacks, kind of in the woods and the forested areas, 150 acres. And as I'm listening to this, I'm Native. I'm Mohawk. I'm Gunyagahaga. Cambridge is situated on land that was occupied at one time by Gunyagahaga, by Mohicans and Hurons and others. But Cambridge is really what I would consider part of my ancestral homeland. But there's no Native people that live there anymore. Oh yeah, there's a few. There's a family that moved back, but they're not from there originally. They have no ancestral ties, no indigenous ties to the land. But as I was listening to two board members talk about their vast landholding, and they weren't trying to offend me, they didn't say anything that most people would have considered offensive. But see, that's the whole point about white privilege. When you can talk about what seems, maybe that seems normal that people can have, some of these people have these vast land holdings. And for a certain class of white folk, that is normal. But for Native people displaced from that land, sometimes hearing about it, it can sting a little bit. So what I had done when I spoke about my safe space, I talked about my the place in New York that I screened films, and I talked about Billy Ray Dumark. I didn't make the connection real clear between what I heard from these two board members and what Billy Ray Dumark's experience was. But I still come back to this idea that there are a class of people that have privilege. And what happens is when that privilege gets challenged, Columbus Day gets canceled, that privilege turns into fragility, and then action happens. So, look, we can argue about what's more dangerous, a white supremacist or somebody who's feeling fragile because of their whiteness. I would argue the latter. I mean, it's like an animal. If an animal is threatened, is when they're the most dangerous. And sometimes the response is violent. When people are threatened, sometimes the response is violent. So what we saw was the privilege that this whole class of Italian-American politicians had to affect change immediately because they felt violated. They weren't concerned about greater good. They weren't worried about policy or social justice, none of that stuff. They were worried about their personal loss, their sense of loss, because a holiday that they have now attributed with Italian-American heritage. And again, I've said this before on the show, and I'm going to say it again. When I heard Andrew Cuomo suggest that there's no way that he's ever going to support taking Columbus statues down because Columbus has come to represent Italian-American heritage, I'll say it again. That's the same thing that those people in the South and other places who wave their rebel flags and support Robert E. Lee statues, that's the same thing they say. They say, no, it's not about slavery. I'm not flying this flag because of slavery. I'm flying this flag because of Southern pride. It represents Southern American heritage. Well, it's the same thing that the governor of the state of New York said about Italian-American heritage. Yes, it's attributed to these atrocities committed by Columbus or Robert E. Lee or the South, slaveholders and all that other stuff. But we're going to pretend that we're not celebrating that. We're going to pretend we're not celebrating Christopher Columbus. So when you turn Columbus Day into Italian-American Heritage Day, I don't care if you split it with Indigenous People Day. If you turn it into Italian-American Heritage Day, you haven't changed a damn thing. All that's been demonstrated with that was white privilege and white fragility. But again, it's amazing because I do this show not to convince Italians to hate Columbus Day. I do this show because perspective matters. And the perspective that I have when I hear white people talking about their vast land holdings is probably going to be different than the perspective of somebody who will not be triggered by that. I mean, the perspective that Billy Ray Dumark had on his ride for the Dakota 38 ride was different than the filmmaker from Long Island. And look, I can appreciate why he couldn't understand. My concern is that he may still not understand. Because we can't acknowledge that white privilege exists. White supremacy doesn't exist. White privilege does. And when white privilege is threatened, it turns into white fragility. If you never heard those three expressions strung together, it's important to know that dynamic. See, if white people were really superior, they wouldn't need the privilege and they wouldn't need to feel fragile. In fact, white fragility and white privilege are proof that white supremacy doesn't really exist. It's a lie, but it's a lie we're all living with. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.